All right, so the last topic we're going to get into here is the role of these micronutrients in bone health, specifically focusing on minerals here, and then a very short amount going into cell communication. So a reminder, minerals are the inorganic compounds that we're consuming. So there's no carbon backbone structure. Typically these compounds of 2 or 3 atoms that are going to be separated into their individual atoms, usually involving ions, so charged atoms like these major minerals that we'll be talking about, and then we use them that way. Right? So we've already talked about a few of these today. Or in this slide set, we'll be focusing on calcium, phosphorus, and magnesium, as well as the vitamins D, K, and A, and then a little bit about fluoride. So as I've mentioned a couple times throughout the other slides, our skeleton is not only acting as structure and then our bones or our muscles can use that structure to provide us with movement, but they're also our main calcium reserve, or calcium storage. So if you look at the composition of bone here, and then the amount of each of these ions that is found in our bones, or amounts that is present in our body, the percentage of that is found in our bone, right? We can see that there are a lot of our minerals are being stored here. So calcium makes up 39% of your bone, and 99% of the calcium in your body is found in your bone. We have much smaller amounts for potassium, sodium, magnesium, and then some higher ones for carbonate and phosphate. And so our bone is mostly inorganic materials, these hydroxyapatite crystals, which I'll talk more about here in a second. And then the organic portion, the collagen, is very small, and the cells only make up about 2% of the mass of our actual bone. The rest is coming from these minerals. Okay? And then a large amount of calcium, carbonate, phosphate, half of the magnesium in our body is all stored in our bones. Okay? So they're basically a bank for calcium. Right, so these are the hydroxyapatite crystals I was saying, the inorganic component of bone, which is 67% of our bone. It's going to be made up of calcium, phosphate, and magnesium crystals. And so our calcium ions have a variety of function. They function in cell membranes for the permeability of sodium, which is going to play a role in signal transduction. So a major part of our brain and spinal cord signal transduction pathways, allowing for the release of neurotransmitters. They play a big role in our muscle function. Calcium needs to bind with a protein within our muscle cells that allows the binding of a different protein, which is going to cause the movement, the shortening of those muscle fibers, allowing us to contract. And then cell messages all across the board here. Okay. So a bit of info about our bones before moving forward. Right. So bones have an inorganic and organic component. So we have the hydroxyapatite crystals, which are calcium, phosphate, and magnesium salts, making up a majority of our bone mass. Collagen, which is the organic portion of our matrix, making up a majority of our bone mass here. So collagen is the organic portion of that matrix. And then we have our actual bone cells, which only make up about 2% of the mass of our bone. So we have various types of cells. Our osteoprogenitors are the stem cells that are going to produce immature bone cells called osteoblasts. Osteoblasts are going to play a role in depositing more calcium into our bone. So when we have excess calcium, osteoblasts are what are going to store them. And then a mature osteoblast is called an osteocyte. They basically are storing or depositing more and more calcium, moving further towards the center of this bone, and eventually will become surrounded by the calcium they're depositing and be basically trapped in there. So we only have a few osteocytes actually within the main hard portion of our bone, surrounded by the hydroxyapatite crystals and collagen fibers that they are creating and depositing. And so our osteoblasts are going to show up here as different vitamins and minerals can increase the activity of these osteoblasts, thus depositing more calcium. And then lastly, we have osteoclasts, which are the phages of our bone. They break down these crystals and thus can release calcium, phosphorus, and magnesium into our blood. So when we need more calcium, we will activate osteoclasts through these other vitamins, minerals, and hormones, thus breaking down some bone and releasing that calcium for us to use. So vitamin K is going to play a big role in those osteocytes, and vitamin C and collagen, or sorry, vitamin C, helping in activating those osteoblasts, and then vitamin A, activating osteoclasts. So vitamin D, so if bones are a bank for calcium, you can consider vitamin D the banker, right? That is what is going to contribute to how much of it is being stored. Vitamin D is one of our fat-soluble vitamins, very common in our dairy products. A lot of fortified dairy products will have more vitamin D added to them, as well as some meats like beef and fish. And our own bodies can produce active vitamin D as a reaction to exposure to the sunlight. And it is sunlight radiation that is within this wavelength of 270 to 290 nanometer wavelength that it can penetrate deep enough into the bottom two layers of your skin to actually stimulate the synthesis of these pre-vitamins that will turn into vitamin D. However, this is less probable the farther away you are from the equator. And this is because our Earth tilts on an axis, right, throughout the year. And so in seasons where you are tilted farther away from the sunlight is being refracted and changing wavelength to a wavelength that cannot penetrate deep enough to stimulate vitamin D. And so this is going to account for basically half of America. Right? And it's at this 40-degree line, latitude line that will show up here in a second. That we'll look at here in a second. But yeah, so I'll talk more about that as we come back to it. And vitamin D also acts as a hormone. They can act as a long-range messenger. So we produce it in our skin as a reaction to solar exposure, or we can get it from our food, produce all these various functions. So this is that 40-degree line that I was talking about. Basically anything north of this during winter, the sunlight, the rays are going to be refracted and be out of that 270 to 290 wavelength range that I was just talking about. And so because they are now out of that range, they cannot penetrate the skin deep enough to activate the production of the pre-vitamin that will turn into vitamin D. And so this was a big deal, something to learn for me. I'm from Florida, and I've only moved to Seattle within the past couple of years. And so I'd known of the relationship between sunlight and vitamin D, and had heard of issues with vitamin D deficiencies in areas like Washington. And I had just correlated that to how cloudy it gets here in winter. And since living here, I've noticed that we have plenty of sunny days in the winter. Yes, it's more often cloudy, but figured if I just take advantage of those sunny days and get outside, I'm kind of making up for the cloudiness that we get throughout. Come to learn, it doesn't matter that the sun is out during winter, because the tilt of our axis is so far that the sunlight literally isn't penetrating deep enough to stimulate vitamin D. So during the winter, your body cannot produce it if you are just relying on sunlight. You can get, they're called like happy lights. You can take vitamin D supplements that will end up making up for that, right? And that is really important because vitamin D plays a role in lots of other things. So when we can synthesize it, when the sunlight rays are penetrating deep enough, this produces a pre-vitamin in those bottom two layers of the skin. Okay. Right. Okay. And then it will become active and converted into vitamin D within other organs like the liver and kidney, and then be able to go produce their function. So vitamin D is going to play a role in calcium and phosphorus absorption from the small intestine. It regulates how much calcium we actually have available in our blood. So it works with a hormone called parathyroid hormone to stimulate the activity of osteoclasts, which are going to break down those calcium, phosphate, magnesium crystals and release more calcium into the blood. So when we have calcium levels dropping to a threshold that is too low, vitamin D will stimulate, or will work with parathyroid hormone to stimulate the release of calcium. And so it also plays a role in a hormone that has the opposite effect, calcitonin, which is going to stimulate the storage of calcium, the deposition of calcium when we have levels that are too high. Right? So we have calcitonin and parathyroid hormone doing opposite effects, both playing a role in homeostasis, trying to maintain a balance. And so they can affect how much is being stored, how much is being absorbed, and how much is being excreted from our bodies. And so say you drink some milk or enriched milk containing vitamin D, that vitamin D will aid in the absorption of calcium from our small intestine. It will aid in the delivery of that calcium throughout the blood to our osteoblasts, and then those osteoblasts will deposit it. When blood calcium levels drop too low, parathyroid hormone will be released in order to increase activity of the osteoclasts, which will break down our bone and release calcium. And then calcitonin does the opposite. It inhibits those osteoclasts and increases excretion, trying to lower how much calcium we have in our blood. So you see all these various pathways shown here. All these arrows are showing an activation or stimulation, and all these like hard stop lines are showing inhibition. You can see where these various hormones play a role and where vitamin D plays a role. All right. And so vitamin D deficiencies end up playing a role in calcium deficiencies, right? Since it affects storage, absorption, excretion. And so a deficiency of vitamin D can associate with these various bone issues that we see. So in children, having a deficiency can lead to stunted growth because your bones aren't growing correctly, and something that we call rickets, where we're not adding enough calcium to our bones, so they're weaker bones. So as the body grows and becomes heavier, the not yet fully mature like edges of the bone will start to bend under that weight. And so that gives rickets, where your bones are a bit bendy or can become associated with bow-legged, like what you see in this X-ray here. In adults, you see a similar result, but because their bones have matured, you don't have that same bendy effect where it's pushing the outer edges of the bone. Instead, you just have like more brittle bones, known as osteoporosis or improper mineralization, osteomalacia. And so for most of our life, or most of our early life, calcium deposition, creating new bones, storing calcium in our bones, outstrips or outperforms our calcium breakdown. So up until around 30 years old, your body is more efficient at storing calcium than it is at releasing calcium. And then after around age 30, the osteoblast activity declines, and thus your body is less effective at storing your calcium. And so being careful with your vitamin D and calcium levels is going to be important in maintaining bone health throughout later years of life. Right? So you're losing bone mass. Okay, these next few slides just showing where you can get, or what good sources of foods can give you these different minerals. Again, highlighted are the sources that are the best per kilocalorie, but all these are showing per one serving. So our dairy products here, a lot of calcium in them. Sardines with bones in them are going to give you a lot of calcium. So you can look at that for phosphorus and magnesium as well. And then just a little bit about where you see them, or sources versus bioavailability of that calcium within those sources. Right, so again, we've touched on this topic a few times now. Even if a food has a high concentration of whatever nutrient you're looking for, that nutrient needs to be absorbable. Thus, it needs to be bioavailable in order to actually get the benefits and use that in your body. And so different sources will have different ranges of how much of their calcium is actually bioavailable. So our vegetables here, like cauliflower, Brussels sprouts, kale, have a much higher concentration of bioavailability or bioavailable calcium compared to our what we typically associate with calcium, our dairy products. All right. And we're not going to go into too much detail about cell communication, but our minerals do play a big role in that. These ions are going to be moved into or out of a cell in reaction to other ions moving into or out of a cell, thus creating signals that will produce other results, such as the release of calcium in your muscles to allow them to contract. And, so these major minerals, calcium, sodium, potassium, chlorine, and manganese, play a big role in those cell communication pathways. Okay, so calcium for most of our neural cells, sodium and potassium for majority of your other cells, play a big role in that cell communication. So that's all for this unit. I hope that was helpful. Please feel free to reach out with any questions, and good luck.